I remember the exact sound that made me stop breathing, the soft, almost tender click of the monitor being turned off. It was the sound that did not belong in a hospital room, where a child's lungs were the size of two fragile, fragile things held together by tubes and quiet machinery. If I had to place the moment that split my life, it would be that click. It was so small, so ordinary, so easily mistaken for nothing, that no one could imagine how deliberate it would be, later revealed to be. But I knew, with the kind of knowledge that does not come from evidence but from the way your body reads betrayal, that the click was not accidental. Who would ever believe me if I spoke it out loud? Who would believe a mother who had been told to trust family, to set aside old hurts for the sake of peace, to keep her voice soft in front of those who wore responsibility like armor? My name is Emily Hart, 31 years old, an assistant project manager at a small architectural firm in suburban Denver, a woman who always thought she understood the currency of favors and the economy of apologies. My daughter June was 7. She had been born early and with fragile lungs that could refuse to cooperate without warning. For as long as I could remember, I lived in a kind of half-light timing, medications measuring breaths, learning to read the smallest color change in her lips. June liked to draw tulips, and she called me Mama when she wanted cinnamon toast. I would have done almost anything to protect those two pieces of ordinary joy. My sister Claire had been as steady as an anchor for as long as anyone could remember. We grew up on the east side of town, where there was a single main street with a diner that still served pies. Like they meant something, Claire always wore confidence like a coat. She knew how to fix cars and fill out forms, and make sure our mother did not miss a single appointment. When our father left and our mother's health turned toward decline, Claire stepped in. She became the person who kept calendars, called clinics, and handled the household money. People called her dependable. People called her strong. Our mother called her indispensable. That dependency became a kind of currency in our family. It bought praise, a seat at the table, the right to make decisions without being questioned. I was the sensitive one, the one who cried at commercials and wrote in notebooks. No one read. When June's asthma began to demand attention, our mother, who I will call Ruth, began to spend more nights at my apartment and more mornings making sure June had her inhaler in her backpack. It felt like help. It felt like grace. But it also felt like a redistribution of the thing Claire had always thought defined her worth. You learn how to ignore the small, cold things that slide between people when you are exhausted, and you have a child to keep breathing. You rationalize, you tell yourself, Claire is just practical. You tell yourself she does not know how to show warmth. You tell yourself the family is complicated, because all families are complicated. I told myself those things because I needed sleep, because June's next breathing treatment was 4 hours away. Because if I let myself see the way Claire's jaw tightened when Mom praised my resilience, I might never leave the house again. So when Claire offered to come with us to the pediatric pulmonary clinic for June's scheduled follow-up, I said yes. I wanted the extra set of hands. I wanted the company in the sterile waiting room. I wanted to believe that the old role of dependable sister had softened into something affectionate. Claire arrived in a new coat and a practiced smile. She carried a tote with a thermos and a paperback detective novel. She sat with a stiffness that said she was buying time. She asked questions about June's inhaler dosage, in a tone that sounded practical. Are they sure the spacer is the right size? Can the alarm be adjusted downstairs so it sleeps better? The questions were small, clinical, the kind of interest friends show when they mean well. The appointment went, as appointments always go. Measurements, consults, the nurse making notes on a tablet with a pen slick and efficient. The doctor, a woman with a calm voice and very precise glasses, adjusted June's maintenance medication and reminded us about the rescue inhaler. She recommended that the portable oxygen monitor remain active while June had these episodes, especially at night. The word alarm was said with that clinical neutrality that should have been comforting. The nurse explained how the device could be muted by mistake and how the logs would tell us when it had been manually disabled. I nodded like a woman who had read the pamphlet 100 times. That afternoon, we returned to the small apartment I rented, close enough to the clinic for convenience, but far enough from the old neighborhood that being there felt like starting over. June sat on the kitchen counter, swinging her legs and drawing tulips with all the concentration a 7-year-old could muster. Claire hovered near the window like a watchful guest. For a moment, while sunlight spilled across the linoleum and the kettle whistled, it felt like any other Sunday. I left the room for a moment to put a casserole in the oven and told Claire I would be right back. I asked her to sit with June, and she smiled and said, "Sure." The stove clicked when the casserole heated. The sound of the oven was a domestic metronome. I did not have the sense of dread that later lodged itself like a splinter. Because how could I? How do you suspect someone who has always been the one who came through? The minutes passed like soft notes. I checked my phone messages from work, a reminder about a meeting in the morning. I was in the kitchen for a mere 7 minutes. When I returned, Juna's body was folded too small, her face paler than pale. The oxygen monitor was dark. The clip that connected the monitor to the wall was dangling like a severed promise. No alarm had sounded. I remember the cold sliding up from my stomach and into the back of my throat. I remember the room broadcasting its own silence, as if it had been holding its breath. Claire was standing by the sofa, phone in hand, and her hands were not shaking. They were absolutely steady. I hit the emergency button with a force I had never known my palm could muster. The apartment blurred. There were sounds that belonged to other worlds. Sirens, neighbors knocking, the surgeon's calm voice, then nurses kneeling, the smell of antiseptic. A breathing bag pressing air into June's lungs like a merciful and cruel hand. The monitor finally screamed to life, and the room was suddenly too loud. They worked quickly and efficiently. They told me later that minutes mattered, that hypoxia could do unseen damage the longer it took to reverse. They told me it was a miracle that June's brain had weathered the deprivation without obvious harm. Later, in a sterile corridor that smelled of bleach and stale coffee, a technician told me that the logs indicated the alarm had been disabled manually during the window. I had walked out of the room. The word manually was like a shard. The surveillance footage from the building's hallway cameras was being reviewed. The technicians said these things with a soft, professional distance, as if they could not afford the moral heat of the accusation. My mother called and said, "Are you okay?" And I remember walking through the parking lot with the air cold enough to make my nose sting and telling her, "No, I am not okay." The words felt like they belonged to someone else. At the time, I could not name the truth folded under my fear. I could not say that Claire had been the only one close to the monitor in that interval. I could not say that she had stood over June with a look I had learned to mistake for concentration. Family complicates suspicion. You hesitate because the consequences of believing the worst about kin are sharp and real. They cleave relationships and leave you standing naked in front of prosecutors and neighbors and your own hollowed heart. But here's a thing I have learned since then. When people betray you in such an intimate, cold way, they leave traces. Not just the obvious, like camera footage and device logs, but the small human marks. The way they avoid your eyes when someone mentions mercy. The tone that threads through their apologies like a hidden seam. The bizarre insistence on normalcy in moments that demand chaos. Those traces, once you start looking, gather like snow at the edge of a roof, and they will not be removed by anything but the slow, grinding work of exposure. The police took statements. The hospital kept June under observation for more than a week. The word trial entered our vocabulary, like a shadow. My mother sat with me in the waiting room, but her hands trembled in a way that made me suddenly understand the cost of denial. Claire stopped answering my calls. She sent texts with platitudes. People at work asked if I needed time. I said no, because the idea of being alone inside the quiet that follows fear seemed worse than anything else. But we would not be alone for long. The footage showed her by the monitor. The logs recorded the manual deactivation. The hospital review board convened. When boys at school muttered and followed June on reticent days, I wanted to lose the world. That click had opened something I could not reseal. The rest of my life, as it turned out, would be about learning how to make justice out of the debris left behind. At the end of that first week, while June slept with her small chest rising more steady than it had been before, I made a decision. Not to turn away, not to smooth the story into something convenient, not to let the armor of family myth convince me to swallow the terrible fact of what had happened. I would see this through. I would find the truth. Even if it meant losing what I had left of family, I would make the betrayal count for something more than grief. And so I began to gather the pieces. I began to map out the moments. Like a cartographer, careful and slow, I began softly to plan a kind of payback that would be more than revenge, for spectacle. I wanted a reckoning that held the moral weight of what Claire had risked. I wanted to teach everyone around us what it felt like when someone you should trust tries to destroy your child for reasons you can hardly name. The last line of this morning's medical report read that they would prepare an incident summary for the district attorney. It felt like a small arrow released into a wide sky. There would be hearings, there would be testimony, there would be a public unmasking. But the part of me that had always lived in quiet, who drew tulips with June in the evenings, who answered to work emails at odd hours, and cooked too many casseroles, knew that a courtroom's verdict might not repair the days we had lost. It might not bring back the ordinary safety we once had. Yet revenge does not always mean punishment. Sometimes it is simply taking back the right to name your life. Sometimes it means standing up and speaking in a world that teaches women to hush. I told myself that I was not seeking spectacle. I wanted truth, and I wanted the family pattern that allowed such a thing to happen to be recognized and altered. I closed the notebook where I had been keeping every detail. Time's observations, fragments of memory that felt like evidence. I rubbed my eyes and found in the margin a question: how far would someone go to be seen? It felt like the beginning of another story, inside this one, an explanation that would lead me down darker corridors than I had thought possible. I did not yet know how far I would go, I only knew I could not stop. At the very end of that night, as the city settled and the hospital lights blinked like distant stars, I replayed the hallway footage in my mind. There was a frame, brief and singular, that haunted me. Claire pausing at the nurse's station, glancing toward the pediatric wing, then moving on. It was the kind of tiny move that would have been meaningless in another life. In mine, it was the hinge. It was the chapter closes here because that hinge would become the axis of everything that follows. I had chosen to trust law and truth, but I would learn that justice is not a straight line. It is crooked and slow, and it has surprises inside it that would test me in ways I could not yet imagine. When the district attorney called, I was in the small kitchen stirring tea because the hospital coffee was too sharp for a mind that wanted softness. The voice on the phone was professional, the kind that mattered when you were about to put your life under oath. They said they had enough to file charges and that they wanted me to testify. My first instinct was not fear of the courtroom. It was astonishment that finally someone had seen the manual deactivation in the logs and was willing to call it what it was. I had long rehearsed the words in my head. I could see them as scenes, the monitor lit like a small altar. My back to the hallway, Claire at the foot of the bed. I had practiced keeping my voice steady, letting the facts stand like stones. But practice is different from the interior fracture that happens when your family's faces become the faces of an accusation. I thought of our mother and how she had once braided our hair on summer mornings. I thought of Ruth's hands as they held June's small face and prayed. The memory of that domestic warmth made the legal process feel like an intrusion into a private grief that wanted to be left unexposed. Claire was arrested on a slow, predictable Monday. They did it with quiet efficiency, like a building inspector shutting down a dangerous wiring. I remember the sound of the handcuffs, the way they clinked against the metal of a cart, the clinical tone of the officers reading rights. Claire's expression was calm. Calmness, in such moments, is the thing that most often frightens people because it suggests a person who understands the stakes. and chooses with untroubled eyes to hold their ground. The news spread in the small town like spilled dye. At the grocery store, I saw people look at me with a kind of soft curiosity that felt invasive. My colleagues whispered in the printer room. The silence of our mother when she visited was loud as an accusation. I wanted to go to her and demand a reason to understand why she could protect the daughter who had endangered hers, but I was restrained by something that felt like remorseful strategy. The prosecution needed solidity. Emotion was a tool to be used carefully. The hearing room was a pale box of neutral colors. The judge's bench rose like an altar of authority. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice like tempered steel, carried a folder that smelled faintly of paper and ink. She said that the act of disabling the monitor constituted reckless endangerment and attempted manslaughter, given the knowledge of June's condition. The words had gravity. They turned private terror into public law. The court clerk read the charges and Claire stood with a measured composure. I sat forward when the state presented the logs, showing the manual deactivation. They were small electronic lines that translated into timestamps and actions. The camera footage, grainy but clear in its sequence, placed Claire in the hallway and then entering the apartment building at a precise time. The prosecutor drew a direct line between the manual deactivation and the onset of June's distress. The narrative that had lived in my chest for weeks was now translated into a language that could hold up under cross-examination. Claire's lawyer, a man with a soft smile and a practiced manner, asked if I could be certain that Claire intended harm. It was the question that had been circling like a scavenging bird since the beginning. Did she intend this, or was it a tragic accident? I had rehearsed the answer 100 times. I thought of the way Claire had asked about the alarm settings in the clinic, how she had lingered over the machine like a person memorizing a map. I thought of her voice when she had asked my mother if the alarms could be turned down so June would sleep. I thought of the way she had not looked shocked when the technician later explained the logs. In court, I told the truth as simply as I could. I described the click in the monitoring room as precisely as a person can try to describe sound when their vocabulary is small and their grief is large. I recounted the minute I had been in the kitchen. I spoke of the way the room felt when I returned. I did not make moral proclamations. I did not attempt to paint motives with dramatic brushstrokes. I stuck to what I had seen and the way my body had known something was wrong. When the prosecutor asked whether I believed Claire had deliberately turned off the monitor, I said yes. My voice did not tremble when I said it. It felt like the clearest decision I had made in months. The defense painted a picture of stress and confusion. They suggested that Claire had been emotionally overloaded, that her intentions had been to help to quiet what she perceived as unnecessary noise. That panic had led to a terrible mistake. They called witnesses who described Claire's caregiving her past faithfully, handling our mother's appointments, her innate practicality. It was the picture we all had carried for years. The prosecution countered with the pattern of questions Claire had asked about alarms and the way she had been positioned at the monitor during the window in question. There came a moment in court when my mother was asked to testify. I watched her rise from the bench and take the oath with hands that trembled like the last leaves on a branch. Her testimony was a study in denial. She could not account for the moments recorded on camera. She insisted that Claire would never hurt us, that she had been confused, that the hospital had misinterpreted logs. Watching her reframe what had happened into a softer narrative felt like watching a ship turn its bow away from a reef, while those on board still heard the grinding. The community divided itself in quiet ways. Some neighbors left casseroles and notes that said I was in their prayers. Others stopped inviting us to book club or to the neighbors' potlucks. I began to receive messages that asked gently whether I was sure. The world prefers neat stories where the villain is obvious and the victim is safely wistful. My life was not neat anymore. It was a legal record and a small girl learning how to do breathing exercises with a therapist who used patient voices and practiced patience like it was a medicine. As the trial approached, I found myself counting the small practical things, dates, entries in the log, the times on the camera. I converted every numeric time into words, because it made them feel less like cold timestamps and more like a narrative that could be told aloud. The district attorney wanted the jury to see the sequence as a deliberate, preventable act. The defense wanted the same sequence to look like an error of judgment, tragic but unintentional. Then, in the days before the jury selection, something unexpected arrived in my mailbox, a thin envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph glossy taken from the hallway camera angle, but a slightly different frame. In it, Claire was in the corridor as she had been, but her face was turned toward the camera in a way that did not match the others. She was looking directly at the lens, and her expression was not merely composed, it was flat, as if she knew the camera's presence and cared about it only as a surface. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single sentence in black ink, neat and unadorned. "Not all accidents are accidents." There was no signature. The note felt like a cold hand on my shoulder. It suggested that someone knew more than the logs, more than the cameras, more than the prosecutorial narrative. It hinted at motive in a way that could not yet be substantiated, but that altered the shape of my certainty. I took the photograph to the district attorney, and she put it into a folder with the other evidence. She called it an anonymous tip, and said she would treat it as such. I knew the photograph raised the stakes. It promised that there were other witnesses to Claire's intent, other observers who had seen the edges of the truth and chose for reasons I could not yet know to fold it into paper and send it to me. Why, for what purpose, to threaten, to protect, to incite? That night, I sat with June at the kitchen table and traced a tulip she had drawn. The handwriting on the photograph hung in my mind like a loose thread. The city lights outside our window blinked indifferent. The trial loomed, and I felt the pressure that comes when you are standing between a child and a story that could rewrite your family. I did not know yet whether the photograph would be embraced by the court or dismissed as the work of a meddler. But I understood with a clarity that made my chest ache that the truth has many forms, and sometimes it arrives as a small, anonymous, incandescent thing meant to change everything. The chapter ends with the jury being impaneled the next morning, and a single juror pausing as she looks at me and then at Claire, and in that brief exchange, I feel something shift in the room. The rest of the world is beginning to lean in, and the consequences of naming the betrayal are about to become as real as the paper the photograph was printed on. The question that will carry us through the next weeks is not only whether the law will judge Claire, but whether I will be able to live with what the truth once exposed will demand of me. The jury was seated on a Thursday morning, and the courtroom felt like an old waiting room, in the way that mattered, full of people whose eyes were quietly assessing whether truth would align with their sense of order. I had practiced what I would say until the syllables felt familiar under my tongue, as if I had grown used to carrying the story like a pocketed stone. The prosecutor opened and laid out the sequence with the kind of clarity that made me trust her like a steady lighthouse. The clinic conversations, the alarms, the logs, the hallway footage. She used words I had not considered: reckless endangerment, attempted manslaughter. But then she leaned back and let the human story do some of the heavy lifting. She spoke about favoritism, about how family dynamics can twist into motives, about the way being excluded from an inheritance or a family role can seed bitterness. I watched Claire with the patience that surprised me. She listened. The way people listen to weather forecasts, detached, already believing she knows how the day will turn. In the halls outside the courtroom, whispers gathered like lint. Some neighbors crossed from one side of the street to the other to avoid the glare. My mother had stopped attending hearings. Her absence was a kind of testimony in itself. People asked me whether I hated Claire, as if hatred could be measured in neat boxes on a form. I did not hate her. I felt something more complicated and colder, a disappointment so vast it had the shape of a new future, without the person who had caused it. The first witness for the prosecution was Dr. Patel, the pediatric pulmonologist who had treated June. She spoke with a cadence that made medical facts feel sacred. She described the fragile balance of oxygenation, the swift onset of hypoxia, the ways a child's body can falter when monitoring is interrupted. She explained in patient language why alarms are not annoyances, but lifelines. She walked the jury through the machine logs and how manual deactivation left gaps in monitoring that could, and in our case did allow minutes of unrecognized decline. Then Nurse Elaine testified. She had been on duty the night June nearly stopped breathing. Elaine's voice shook when she recounted how she had walked into the room to find the monitor inert and June struggling for air. She spoke of the smell of the room, then an image I had not thought to notice, but that Elaine turned into meaning, the metallic scent of fear. Elaine also testified about Claire's questions in the days prior, about the specificity with which Claire asked about alarm sensitivity and how alarms could be silenced. Elaine said she had thought Claire was being practical. She said with a kind of quiet regret that she wished now that she had been more suspicious. The defense predictably tried to rebuild the public portrait of Claire as the dependable sister, the one who had always kept the household together, the one who had held the family's frayed seams together when father left and when mother's health declined. They called neighbors to testify about Claire's steady hand, co-workers to speak to her reliability. The narrative was familiar. A woman who had given so much that she deserved trust. Their strategy was to create doubt that Claire meant harm, doubt that the logs really supported the prosecution's claims beyond reasonable question. I watched the defense try to fray the prosecution's fabric with the slow work of insinuation, suggesting stress exhaustion, that perhaps Claire had thought the alarm was defective and had tried to silence what she thought was a malfunction. In cross-examination, though, the prosecutor asked the crisp, small questions that make certainty crumble. Did Claire ask about alarm sensitivity? Yes. Did she linger near the monitor? Yes. Was the alarm disabled manually during the time you were away? Yes. The thread of pattern was thin, but as the evidence accumulated, it began to feel less like a thread and more like a rope. The jury, composed of neighbors and bus drivers and retired teachers, listened as if these small mechanical acts had the capacity to undo everything. Outside the courthouse, someone left a bouquet of lilies at my car. The card said simply, "For truth." The kindness felt like a counterweight to the anonymous photograph I had received. It reminded me that revenge, as my story was beginning to show, was not solely about punishment. There were other acts that read as payback. Speaking truth into the public square, forcing reckoning upon a family that had for so long closed its doors to uncomfortable conversations. I kept that idea close as the trial trudged forward, that some revenge is restorative. It seeks to restore the world to right measure rather than merely to break the wrongdoer. In the days between testimony, I began to notice small things in Claire's manner I had missed before. She wore gloves in the courtroom, even in late spring, a thin pair that hid the small habit of tapping her fingers together, a rhythm I now associated in my mind with calculation. She asked to speak to the bailiff once and requested a change in visitation at the jail. A small administrative ask that betrayed a mind always arranging. It was not evidence, but it was a detail that gathered like shadow. People who meant harm do not always look monstrous. Often they look exactly like a person who can manage paperwork and forward mail. And then came the twist that made my stomach drop and my breath falter at once. The defense called an unexpected witness. A man from Claire's workplace, a contractor who oversaw mechanical equipment, testified that he had shown Claire how certain alarm systems in local pediatric units could be muted in cases when the noise was disruptive. He said it was common practice to adjust alarm sensitivity to prevent false alerts, and that Claire had demonstrated a competence with the interface. The prosecutor objected, arguing the context was different, and that the method of manual deactivation in our hospital was not the same. The judge allowed the testimony, however, and for a moment, the courtroom tilted. I remember the thin, metallic smell of the air in my mouth, as the defense attempted to plant seeds of professional familiarity into the narrative, to make Claire's actions seem like a practiced competence, rather than a deliberate act of betrayal. It was a tactic that relied on making the extraordinary feel ordinary, on taking the click that had shattered my life, and reframing it as an accepted technical maneuver. The prosecution's rebuttal was crisp and effective, pointing out the differences in equipment and protocol, and stressing the knowledge that Claire had asked precise probing questions about our specific monitor settings in the days prior. The days of testimony began to stretch like a map of small towns, each witness a different district. I learned how to live in fragments, half a morning in a lawyer's office, an hour. Remembering a face for the jury, I stopped counting days in ordinary ways and started measuring them by courthouse steps. I learned the peculiar intimacy of courthouse coffee and the way the fluorescent lights drained color from everything until the world looked like a legal document. In the quiet moments between proceedings, I would sit in my car and breathe until my hands stopped shaking, then go inside and sit in the gallery and listen to other people's truths, being apportioned like slices of bread. One evening, after a particularly hard day of testimony, I received a call from the district attorney. She spoke softly and said they were moving to charge Claire with attempted manslaughter. Her voice had a steadiness that resembled both resolve and fatigue. The gravity of the term hit me in the way it is supposed to make you understand that the community had decided to weigh this act with all the seriousness the law could offer. It was a vindication, and yet the taste of vindication is rarely sweet. It is complex, a metallic mixing with the salt of survival. That night, I watched June sleeping and traced the curve of her shoulder with a thumb, as if it were a map I needed to memorize. I thought about the word inheritance that had floated in the prosecutor's opening, how family roles can calcify into expectations of who deserves what when a parent's resources are dwindling. I thought about the way my mother had redistributed her time and attention unintentionally, tilting the scales. I thought about how Claire had internalized that tilt until it became a reason to act. The chapter closes on the day the judge sets the trial date for jury deliberation. Outside the courthouse, Claire's sister, my own mother, walks past me and meets my gaze for the first time in months. For a fraction of a second, her expression changes, an almost invisible wobble between grief and deflection. In that instant, I realize the trial is not just about what Claire did that day. It is about all the small corrosive decisions our family had made over decades. The jury will decide responsibility in a legal sense, but the verdict will not be the end of the story. There are other reckonings to come, and I am only beginning to understand how many doors must be opened before the house we live in is aired. There is a peculiar acoustic moment when the world waits for a verdict. The courtroom becomes a lung held for breath. In that space, every cough from the gallery feels loud, every rustle of paper like an omen. I sat in that space while the lawyers made their closing arguments, the prosecutor weaving the factual narrative into moral language, insisting that our community could not tolerate a person who intentionally endangered a child in the name of misplaced pride or twisted need for attention. The defense with equal grace painted Claire as a woman under strain, a caregiver at the edge of burnout, a sister who made a tragic mistake, born of love and exhaustion. As the jury retired to deliberate, I felt the hollow press of days that had already been lost weigh on me more than ever. The courtroom emptied into a long afternoon of non-time. My phone buzzed. Messages of support, offers to bring food, the thinly worded condolences from neighbors who did not know what to say. I walked outside and felt the sun against my face and wished with a fierce private longing that this could be resolved with a clean sentence that fit the deed. Reality is rarely so tidy. The jury returned hours later with expressions that betrayed nothing. They had chosen, as juries often do, to keep their counsel close to the ribs. The foreperson read the verdict in a voice that seemed to come from far away. Guilty of reckless endangerment. The courtroom exhaled as if a long-held breath had been released. For a moment, the legal system had offered a clear response, a nod from communal morality. There was applause among a small pocket of supporters in the gallery, and a clenching silence among Claire's circle. Claire did not cry. She held herself like a person who has prepared for loss. The sentencing was set for a future date that fluttered like an unfinished promise from my calendar. The prosecutor hugged me in the hallway, with the kind of quiet we reserve for people who have been carrying weight for too long. The media took note, and a few small outlets wrote pieces that turned my private terror into public narrative. My life, which had once lived in the quiet light of bedrooms and tulip drawings, now had a public edge. The word revenge circulated in comments as if it were a banner people could wave. Some suggested I had orchestrated a spectacle. Others praised me for speaking truth. After the verdict, community reactions skewed sharply. Some friends sent casseroles and offers to drive me to appointments. Others withdrew. Their silence felt like a kind of social punishment that cut in a different direction. My mother's calls were fewer. When we did speak, there was a new carefulness to her voice, like someone testing the weight of every phrase before releasing it. One evening, she asked me softly whether I had forgiven Claire. I told her forgiveness and justice were not the same thing. It is possible to want both simultaneously, but they arrive on different schedules. In the weeks that followed, I began to prepare for the sentencing hearing. The district attorney asked if I would read a victim's impact statement, and although my hands trembled at the thought, I agreed. I wanted the court to see the human story, not merely the logs and photographs. I wanted the judge to understand what those 5 minutes had done to a family's soul. I sat for nights composing the statement like a letter to a future that might be kinder. I described June's fear in the mornings, her need for physical therapy, the way she flinched at sudden noises. I wrote about the small victories, how she had learned to count breaths to calm herself, how she could sleep now with the monitor beside her bed, and I asked the judge to consider the full measure of harm inflicted. But the sentencing day brought another kind of revelation. The defense's last-minute motion had produced an unexpected witness, an elderly woman who claimed to have known Claire's father from years back. She testified in a shaky voice that Claire had as a child been overshadowed by others and had always needed to carve space for herself by being indispensable. Her testimony was meant to humanize. Instead, it tied a cultural thread across decades that suggested a pattern of needing to be needed. It was a narrative that, while sympathetic, made me understand the deep rot of family favoritism, the slow accrual of attention, and the way it can calcify into entitlement. The judge listened to every testimony with the kind of solemnity the bench demands. At the end of the hearing, she called Claire forward and spoke with authority about accountability. The sentence was not theatrical. Prison time, measured in months, not years, with conditions that included counseling and restricted contact with the family. Claire's expression as the sentence was read was quietly unreadable. Later, as she was led out, she turned her head briefly in my direction. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw in her face a flash of something like regret, or maybe just the recognition of consequence. It did not make the sentence lighter. It made it irrevocable. After the hearing, my life did not return to normal. It returned to a new normal that had an edge I had not anticipated. Friends rallied. Therapists recommended slow, steady routines for June's recovery. I found myself drawn to small acts of restoration, planting a window box of tulips, reading aloud at night, cooking dishes that tasted like the past but felt sturdier. The house that once held secrets now held the practice of repair. We placed locks on cabinets, installed additional monitoring, and I began the slow work of reteaching safety to a child who had shuddered awake to a world that could be dangerous, even from within. And yet, as the weeks unfolded, other consequences rippled outward. Our mother Ruth retreated into a quiet that looked like sorrow, but read to many as withdrawal. She stopped inviting neighbors over. She stopped attending the little church services she had once loved. I visited, but the conversations felt like tossing pebbles into a deep well. No ripples returned. The family business of pretending there had been no harm had ended. In its place, a broken, honest accounting had begun. Then, about 2 months after the sentence, a letter arrived at my apartment with the same thin envelope and no return address. Inside, it was a sealed document, an old will with my mother's name at the top. It had been drafted years earlier, and to my shock, it named Claire as the primary beneficiary of a trust that included the family's small house and the remaining savings. My mother had never mentioned this will. The letter included a short note from an anonymous hand. She never told you because she believed you would not fight. The handwriting was different from the previous photograph, but the voice felt like a continuation. The document complicated everything. It suggested motives that the trial had hinted at, but not fully explored: inheritance and exclusion, the ways family resources become a battlefield. It suggested that our mother's shifting attention toward me had not only been kindness, but also a redistribution of power that Claire may have perceived as loss. The notes claim that my mother believed I would not fight felt like an insult layered on top of betrayal. It suggested that the family had long operated by unspoken rules of who deserved care and why. I took the will to a lawyer who specialized in estates. He explained the technicalities, how a will could be contested, how circumstances such as coercion or undue influence might be argued. The legal avenues opened new doors for confrontation that I had not expected to walk through. It was as if the courtroom had revealed one axis of truth, and the estate documents had opened another. My life now had multiple threads of conflict running through it: criminal justice, family law, and the private grief I carried like an extra coat in winter. The chapter closes on the day I call my mother and ask in a voice that trembles despite my resolve why she never told me about the will. She answers with a silence so full that I can almost hear the spaces between her words. When she finally speaks, she does not offer the clarity I seek. Instead, she says quietly that she was afraid of what would happen if she told us what she really thought. The line goes dead. In that hush, I feel the next chapter dawning, the one where I must decide whether to fight, not just for June's safety, but for the truth of how we had come to be a family that could do such harm. I did not sleep the night my mother's voice broke across the phone line. Her silence before speaking had been its own confession, but the quiet after she hung up was worse. It felt like standing in the doorway of a house you once believed was safe, only to find the wallpaper peeling. The foundation, split the rooms rearranged by someone who never thought you'd come back and look closely. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, tracing the rim of a mug that had gone cold. June's breathing machine hummed softly from her bedroom, its rhythm steady, a small mercy in a world that had so few left. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house on Birch Lane, a small one-story place with faded blue shutters and a porch swing that used to be our favorite place to read. The street was quiet, lined with oaks that shed early in the year. When I stepped onto the porch, the swing was still, and the air had that faint scent of dust and lemon cleaning, the way it always did after Mom had been awake, worrying. I knocked, not expecting her to answer, but she did slowly, as if each step toward the door had been negotiated with her own guilt. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way a person shrinks under the weight of truths they've carried too long. I stepped inside and felt memories brush against me like a cold curtain. The smell of stew simmering on winter nights, Claire's homework scattered across the table, my childhood drawings taped to the fridge. Now the house felt like a museum of unfinished conversations. "Why didn't you tell me about the will?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She folded her hands in front of her, the way she always did when she braced for impact. "Because I didn't want to lose both of you," she whispered. Her answer hurt more than denial would have. Losing both implied she already knew she was losing one. I sat across from her at the dining table, the same table where Claire had once scolded me for forgetting to refill Mom's prescription, where Mom had complained that I was too sensitive, too emotional, too easily overwhelmed. The table that had quietly taught us who was allowed to struggle and who wasn't. Mom sank into the chair across from me. "Claire was the responsible one," she began slowly. "She took care of me. She handled the bills, the appointments, the house repairs. You had June. You had enough on your shoulders." I waited. The silence between her words stretched thin. "So you rewarded her for doing what you expected of her," I said, "and you punished me for needing help." Her eyes glistened. "It wasn't punishment, I didn't want to burden you with anything else." Then she added the words that would become the fracture line between us. but I also didn't want Claire to feel overlooked. I leaned back in the chair, the truth settling over me like dust. "So you chose her." "I chose peace," she murmured. "Or I tried." There it was. The truth. So many families lived under peace at any cost, even if the cost was justice. Truth. A child's safety. I thought of the anonymous note. "She believed you would not fight." The words made new sense. Mom hadn't just hidden the will. She had hidden her belief about me that I was the one who kept quiet, so the peace held. "You need to understand," Mom whispered. Claire didn't mean to hurt June. I stared at her, waiting to see if she would flinch at her own words. She didn't. That hurt the most. "She nearly killed her," I said. "You saw the logs." She was exhausted. Mom insisted, her voice trembling now. "You don't know how much pressure she was under." "What pressure?" I demanded. "Enough pressure to endanger a child. Enough pressure to turn off a medical alarm she knew kept June alive." Mom pressed her fingers to her forehead, as if the truth was too bright to look at. Directly, Claire thought, she believed, that you'd taken my attention. She thought she was losing her place, losing her value. "So she wanted to take something from me?" I asked quietly. "My daughter." A sob escaped her, then sharp and raw. She covered her face with her hands. I didn't know she cried. I didn't know she would go that far. I stood slowly, moving toward the doorway because something inside me was beginning to split open. "You did know she was unraveling," I said. "You just didn't want to see it. And now you want me to make peace with the fact that my child almost died, so Claire wouldn't feel overlooked." Mom reached for my hand. "Please don't leave like this. I can't lose both my daughters." I pulled my hand back. "You already did," I said softly. "You just don't know it yet." As I walked out of the house, I felt the sun on my face, warm and utterly indifferent. There is a moment in every revenge story, not the loud cinematic moment, but a quiet one, when a person realizes they can't go back. When the house behind them becomes a place they once lived, not a place they still belong. I reached my car and leaned against the door, breathing deeply, letting the truth settle. This wasn't just Claire's betrayal. It was a family system that had rewarded silence and punished vulnerability for decades. Claire hadn't snapped out of nowhere, she'd been built. Now that architecture was collapsing, that afternoon I drove to the law office handling the estate. I carried the will, the anonymous note, and the knowledge that my mother's choices had set the stage for everything that followed. The lawyer reviewed the documents and offered a slow, careful nod. "You have grounds to contest the will," he said. "A strong case, actually. But you need to be prepared. Contesting it will fracture your family further." I thought of June. I thought of the oxygen monitor. I thought of the click. "Then let it fracture," I said. When I left the office, the sky was turning a milky shade of rose. There are moments when revenge begins, not with rage, but with clarity. And as I buckled my seatbelt, I realized I wasn't fighting for money or property or recognition. I was fighting to rewrite the story of who gets protected in my family. June would never be the cost of someone else's insecurity again. The anonymous photograph and the anonymous note were still tucked in the glove compartment, reminders that this story wasn't finished. Someone out there knew more than they had said. Someone had watched Claire long before I had, and they weren't done talking. 3 weeks after confronting my mother, I received another envelope, this one thicker, almost swollen, like it contained more than paper. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot as I was packing June's lunch. She sat at the kitchen table, humming softly as she arranged strawberries into neat rows, unaware that our lives were about to tilt again. I opened the envelope with careful fingers, half expecting another unsigned message. Instead, several printed documents fell onto the counterbank statements. Transaction logs and a single photograph of Claire standing outside a small financial services office on Willow Heights Road. She was wearing a navy coat, her posture sharp, her gaze fixed on the door as if she were preparing for a confrontation. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the dates on the banking statements, transfers from my mother's account to an account in Claire's name, regular deposits increasing over the past 2 years. Not payments for caregiving, not reimbursements. These were large sums, transferred quietly, consistently. Money motive pressure. The anonymous sender was not just revealing Claire's actions, They were building a case. I sat heavily at the table. June looked up, her expression soft and curious. "Mama," she asked. I tucked the documents under a folder. "Just papers, sweetheart," I said. "Finish your strawberries." But inside, something had shifted. The photograph, the handwriting, the new documents. It was too precise to be guesswork, too deliberate to be coincidence. Whoever was sending these knew our family finances, knew Claire's movements, knew which pieces of truth would widen the cracks. After dropping June at school, I drove straight to the district attorney's office. The receptionist greeted me with polite calm, and soon the assistant DA, a man named Thomas Reed, ushered me into a glass-walled conference room. I laid the documents before him. He studied them with a seriousness that made my stomach tighten. "These transfers are significant," he said. "They suggest financial dependency, or leverage." "Leverage," I echoed. He nodded. "Claire may have felt entitled to your mother's estate because she believed she had bankrolled your mother's life, or that your mother owed her. That sense of entitlement could easily evolve into resentment when she saw attention shift toward you and June." The puzzle pieces clicked with cold precision, and the photograph I held. Reed lifted it gently. "This office handles debt restructuring. It's possible Claire was facing financial strain she didn't tell your mother about, strain your mother didn't anticipate. Debt dependency. Desperation." The DA looked at me with a measured expression. "Emily, whoever is sending these documents seems invested in revealing Claire's motives. That means they're close enough to have access to her private information. But not close enough to come forward openly," I said. "Or not willing," Reed replied, "which is its own warning." The thought settled heavily. Someone was pulling strings from the shadows, pushing me toward an understanding I hadn't asked for, but no longer could ignore. Driving home, I replayed every moment of the last year. Claire's clipped tone, when Mom praised me, her questions at the clinic, her strange detachment when June collapsed. To the outside world, she was the dependable daughter. But beneath that exterior, a storm unfolded. Quiet, invisible, then catastrophic. That evening, as June practiced her breathing exercises on the living room rug, I opened the financial statements again. One transfer, nearly 6 months before the hospital incident, was larger than the rest. Money moved from my mother's account to Claire's, just days after a heated argument Mom and I had over childcare. Mom had accused me of depending on her too much. I had told her she didn't have to choose between us. She had cried, then hugged me, and we had pretended it was resolved. But the transfer suggested otherwise. Mom had soothed the conflict with money, not truth. I felt anger rise, not hot, but deep, slow, tidal. It wasn't fury directed at Claire alone now. It was the realization that the dynamics that shaped her actions had been cultivated in quiet corners for years. The next day, the lawyer handling the estate called. He had reviewed the documents and believed they strengthened my position to contest the will. "Emily," he said gently, "if you proceed, you should be prepared for your mother to contest back. This could become a full-scale suit." "I understand," I said, and I did. A family that had been rotting from the inside would not heal without exposing the infection. That night, as June slept, I walked through the apartment, the soft city glow spilling through the windows. I stopped at the counter where the anonymous documents lay and traced the photograph of Claire with a fingertip. Someone wanted me armed with every truth my family had buried. Why? Who were they protecting me, June? Or themselves? Before I could answer that question, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. Some things weren't meant to be brought to light." My breath caught. The message wasn't a warning. It was a threat. And the sender was no longer anonymous by accident. They were watching. The revenge story I thought I was telling had just revealed its second villain. One who knew more than I did. One who wasn't afraid to push one who had stayed in the shadows for a reason. And they had just stepped closer. The message stayed on my screen long after it stopped vibrating, a thin line of black letters that seemed to pulse with their own intention. Stop digging. Some things weren't meant to be brought to light. I stared at it for so long I began to memorize the spacing between the words, the slight slant of the font, the faint blur where my thumb had trembled. Threats have a particular temperature. They're not hot. They're cold. Cold like a basement or a breath drawn in fear. And as I stood in my dim kitchen, June asleep down the hall, I felt that temperature crawl across my skin. I took a screenshot and sent it to the district attorney's office before I let myself breathe again. Then I locked the door, checked every window, and walked into June's room just to watch her chest rise and fall. She slept with her cheek pressed against a stuffed blue rabbit, her breath soft, steady, innocent. I touched her hair gently, promising myself no one would ever get close enough to hurt her again. Not Claire. Not whoever lurked behind these messages. Not whatever poison my family had let fester. The next morning, the DA's office called me before I'd finished pouring cereal. Emily Reed said, his voice clipped with focus. We traced the number. It's a burner phone purchased at a corner store on the east side, paid in cash. No cameras, no ID requirement. So the sender's careful, I said. Very, he replied. And based on what they've already sent you, they have access to information the average person wouldn't. Bank transfers, surveillance stills, estate documents. This isn't casual interference. It's someone with motive. Motive to help me, I said. Or motive to scare me. Reed paused. The line between those two isn't always clear. I thought of the photograph, the bank statements, the anonymous handwriting that seemed almost practiced. Was this person forcing the truth into daylight, or manipulating me into a conflict bigger than I understood? By late morning, I had made up my mind to visit my mother again. I needed to ask about the bank transfers. I needed to see whether she would finally speak plainly. The drive to Birch Lane felt shorter than before, as if dread made the roads fold forward. When I stepped onto her porch, the air felt uneasily still. Mom opened the door before I could knock twice. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if the walls had begun listening. "Emily, please. We need space." "No," I said firmly, "we need honesty." She sagged against the doorway as if those words were heavier than grief. "Come in." I sat at the dining table again, the morning light slanting across the wood, the same way it had when we were girls doing homework. Mom's hands shook as she poured tea, the spoon tapping against the mug too many times. "Why were you giving Claire money?" I asked. "Monthly transfers, sometimes more." She closed her eyes. She said she needed help. She already had the will, I pressed. She already had the house, the trust. Why more? Because she said she was drowning. Mom burst out, her composure collapsing. She said she was keeping the family together while you were busy with your own struggles. I stiffened. Busy raising a child with a medical condition. Busy working 2 jobs to make ends meet. That's what she told you. Mom wiped tears from her face with trembling fingers. She said, you didn't understand responsibility the way she did. She said she was carrying everything. And you believed her, I said quietly. I didn't want to lose her, Mom whispered. She was all I had left when your father left. She was the one who stayed. And I didn't stay, I asked. You drifted. You had June. You became consumed by her care. Claire said you were pulling away. And I thought I could keep us together if I kept her anchored. By paying her, I thought bitterly. By feeding a growing void inside her that could never be filled. Mom, I said slowly, do you think Claire would ever hurt me on purpose? No, she said immediately, too quickly. Not you, never you. What about June? Her breath hitched. A full second passed, then 2. She wouldn't. Mom insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. She wouldn't. I pushed the financial documents toward her. You were enabling her. You didn't see she was unraveling. I saw, Mom whispered. I just didn't want it to be true. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. I can't do this anymore. Emily. No, I said. You want me to protect the family image? You want me to pretend we weren't raised in a war of favoritism? But I'm done pretending. Mom sank into her chair as if her spine had been removed. If you contest the will, she said quietly, I'll lose the little piece I have left. You already lost it, I replied. You just haven't admitted it yet. I walked out before she could respond. Outside, the air was sharp, biting. My phone buzzed with a new text. Good, keep pushing. You're finally waking up. No threat this time. No warning. Just approval. That chilled me more deeply than the earlier message. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to stop me. They were trying to guide me. But toward what? The legal battle. The truth. Or a confrontation that could destroy whatever remained of my family. The estate lawyer called early the next week with news that made my chest tighten. Emily, your mother has retained counsel. She intends to defend the will. I sat on the edge of my bed, the day still dim outside the window. I had known this was possible, but hearing it aloud made my mouth go dry. She's ready to testify that Claire was the rightful beneficiary, the lawyer continued. No matter what Claire did, a pause. Inheritance and criminal behavior are separate matters in the eyes of the law. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the wall until the edges blurred. Contesting. The will wasn't just about assets. It was about rewriting a family story. And stories resist being rewritten. They cling, they scream, they break people who try. That afternoon, I received another envelope. This one wasn't mailed. It was slipped under my apartment door. Whoever delivered it had been close enough to touch the doorknob. Inside were 3 items. A copy of the original police report filed the night June almost died. A handwritten letter. My mother's handwriting dated nearly 2 years prior, and a single note in the familiar anonymous print. Now you have the secrets. I unfolded my mother's letter with shaking hands. Emily, I changed the will today. I didn't tell you because I know you'll question me. Claire has always taken care of me. She earned what little I can leave behind. You have June. You have your own life. Please don't resent me for this. I need peace. Love, Mom. I stared at the words until nausea rose in my throat. It wasn't the content. It was the date. It was written weeks after my father's final departure when Mom was unraveling emotionally. Weeks after I had first told her June needed additional therapy sessions I couldn't afford alone. Weeks after Claire had visited Mom daily, bringing groceries, filling prescriptions, whispering God knows what into her ear. This wasn't simply favoritism. It was influence, and possibly coercion. The police report revealed something else. A neighbor had told officers she saw a woman matching Claire's description leaving my apartment building moments before. I found June unresponsive, but she hadn't wanted to get involved. Her statement was buried deep in the file, overshadowed by the medical emergency itself. My phone buzzed again. Ready for the next step? I didn't answer. Instead, I sat at the dining table with the documents spread before me, building a timeline. Pieces that had once seemed unrelated now aligned like falling dominoes. My mother altered the will when she was emotionally vulnerable. Claire was receiving secret funds she never disclosed. A witness placed her outside my apartment that night, and someone with access to all these hidden corners was ensuring I discovered everything. But why? Were they pushing me toward legal justice? Toward exposing my mother? Toward destroying Claire completely? Or toward something darker? The anonymous sender wasn't protecting me. They were orchestrating me. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. It was a layered betrayal. A manipulation steeped so deeply in the past I could no longer see where it began. That night, after tucking June into bed, I called the district attorney. I told him about the new envelope, the letter, the police report, the witness statement. He exhaled sharply. Emily, this changes the shape of the case. How? It suggests motive. Not just for Claire, he said, but for someone else influencing her. Someone who benefited from conflict between you two. Who would benefit, I asked. A long silence. Then we may be looking at more than one perpetrator. My breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying, he replied carefully, that Claire may not have acted alone. After the call, sleep was impossible. I went to sit in the living room, the quiet pressing against my ribs. The idea that Claire had helped, that someone else had played a role in threatening June's life, made my skin crawl. At 2:38 in the morning, another text arrived. You're closer than you think. My hands shook as I set the phone down. For the first time, I wasn't just afraid of Claire. I was afraid of the truth itself and the shadowed figure dragging me toward it. By the time morning light crept across my curtains, I had not slept a minute. My mind replayed the district attorney's careful words on a loop. Claire may not have acted alone. The idea clung to me like burrs. It reshaped the night in my apartment. The hospital alarms, the bank transfers, even my mother's trembling refusals. It made the anonymous messages feel less like warnings and more like stage directions. I drove June to school, forcing myself to smile, to ask about her art project, to remind her that her inhaler was in the front pocket of her backpack. She hugged me before running inside, a small pair of arms around my waist, an anchor in a sea that was suddenly too deep. When she let go, I stood for a moment watching her cross the schoolyard, her steps light, unaware of the shadow war unfolding around her. I promised myself she would never learn the truth of these days until she was old enough to bear the weight. When I got back to my apartment, a police cruiser was parked in the lot. Detective Harris stepped out. Tall, mid-50s, the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than his questions. He had interviewed me after June's hospitalization, but had remained mostly in the background during the trial. "Emily," he said, nodding, "mind if I come up?" My stomach tightened. "Did something happen? We just need to talk." Upstairs, he eased into one of my dining chairs, glancing around without judgment. He placed a manila folder on the table. "We're reopening a portion of the investigation," he began, "based on what you gave the DA. "The witness statement?" I asked. He nodded. "And the bank records and the content of the anonymous notes." I swallowed. "You think the anonymous sender might be involved?" His eyes flickered just enough to confirm my suspicion. "We're considering all possibilities." He opened the folder and slid a page toward me. "Tell me if you recognize this handwriting." My breath caught. It was a short form, a signature line from a counseling intake document for my mother, dated 2 years ago. She had signed it in her familiar looping script, and below it, a note in smaller handwriting, same slant, same spacing, almost identical to the anonymous messages. I stared numbly. "This looks like..." "Yes," Harris murmured. "We had a handwriting analyst look at the anonymous notes you provided. There's a high probability that at least some of them came from your mother." My stomach dropped. The room tilted. "No," I whispered. "Not all. Maybe one. But..." He slid another page forward, the note that said, "She believed you would not fight," beside a grocery list written by Mom. Same curl on the Y. Same diagonal on the T. "She wrote the will letter," I whispered. "But these were different. Not all of them," Harris said gently. "One was written by someone else. The one that said, 'Not all accidents are accidents.' That one had no matches in our database, but the others..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. My mother had been feeding me evidence. My mother had been warning me, or directing me. I felt cold rise through my limbs. Why would she do that? Harris leaned back slowly. "We have a theory, but I need you to try to hear it before you react." I nodded, gripping the chair until my knuckles whitened. "Someone who feels guilty," Harris said, "often tries to confess without confessing, to bring truth forward without putting their own name on it. It's not uncommon for a parent to try to protect one child from another while also trying to expose the damage done." I stared at him. "You think she helped Claire?" "I think she enabled Claire," he corrected, "financially, emotionally, in ways she may not have understood until too late." "And now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "she may be trying to undo it." He closed the folder. "We need to speak to her formally. But when we attempted contact this morning, she didn't answer the door. Neighbors say she left early. If she reaches out to you, call us immediately." After he left, I stood at the window watching the breeze shift the branches outside. My mother's handwriting on those notes felt like a betrayal layered on top of betrayal. But another feeling slowly crept in, horror. If she was exposing Claire, what was she hiding about herself? I spent the rest of the day pacing the apartment. My phone stayed by my side, the threat text thread open. Hours passed in thick silence. Evening dropped across the sky. I microwaved leftovers for June, read her a bedtime story, waited until her breathing steadied again. At 9:23, my phone rang. "Mom," I answered on the first ring. "Mom, where are you?" the detective said. "Emily," she whispered. Her voice was thready, strained. I didn't want it to go this far. My pulse raced. "Go, how far? What are you talking about?" Silence stretched. "Mom, please. Did you write those notes? Did you send the documents?" "I was trying to protect you," she whispered. "You don't understand how much she needed me." "Who, Claire?" I asked. "No," she said softly. "You..." I froze. She exhaled shakily. "You were always the fragile one, the one who needed care. Claire resented that. I thought, if she could just feel like she was still important, if she felt important, she wouldn't notice how much of me you were taking." Her voice broke on the last word. I felt tears sting my eyes. "Mom, what did you do?" "I didn't know she'd go to your apartment," she sobbed. "I didn't know she would." "Mom," I choked. "Did you know she turned off the monitor?" "I suspected," she whispered. "Afterward, I suspected." I pressed a hand to my mouth. "I couldn't lose both of you," she cried. "I couldn't turn her in. But when the trial started, when I saw what she'd done, I wanted you to know the truth. Just not all at once." "Mom," I whispered, voice cracking. "Why send the threats?" "I didn't," she said quickly. Those came from someone else. My breath stopped. What's someone else? She exhaled the sound, a tiny broken sigh. Your father. My knees buckled. I grabbed the counter to hold myself up. He's back, she whispered. He knows what happened. He's been watching. And he wants something from all of us. What does he want? I asked, voice trembling. Her answer came in a single chilling sentence. He wants the family to break, and he's not done yet. Before I could speak, the line went dead. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, realizing with slow, dawning horror that the betrayal eating my family alive did not start with Claire. It started with the person who had abandoned us years before, and now he had returned. Not for reconciliation, for revenge. I didn't move for almost a full minute after the call ended. The apartment felt wrong, tilted too quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting for my reaction. My father, a man who had walked out of our lives when I was 19, leaving behind overdue bills, a trail of broken promises, and a mother who aged 10 years in one. A man who had never once called on my birthday, never asked about June, never showed his face at hospitals or graduations or funerals. A man I had buried in the cold place of my memory where grief rots into indifference. He was back, and he was watching us. I locked every door and window in the apartment and stood in the hallway listening to June's soft breathing. My hands shook as I slid down the wall, heart thundering. If he'd been sending threats, if he'd been following us, if he had access to Claire's records, then he'd been close, too close. The next morning, after dropping June off at school with a hug that lasted too long, I drove straight to Detective Harris's office. He looked up when I entered, saw the fear written across my face, and stood immediately. What happened, he asked. I told him everything, Mom's confession, the threats she denied, sending the name I hadn't spoken aloud in almost a decade. When I finished, Harris let out a long, low breath. Emily, your father resurfaced 18 months ago, at least on paper. My throat tightened. What does that mean? He opened a small business account under his name in Parker, a repair shop. Shut down 3 months later. No address now. No tax filings since Harris met my eyes, but enough activity that he's not dead. I felt the floor sway beneath me. He didn't show when we first investigated, Harris continued. We assumed he vanished again, but the threats, the timing. He exhaled. We'll put a protective detail near your building. My stomach clenched. Is he dangerous? Harris hesitated before answering. Did he ever hurt you or Claire? Not physically, but neglect wounds in its own way. And the damage he left behind had carved us into roles we never escaped. The responsible daughter, the fragile daughter, the mother trying to divide herself between two impossible needs. He had fractured us long before Claire ever touched an alarm. We need to find him, I said, before he finds us. We will, Harris promised. But promises are soft things. Fear is sharper. That evening, after I picked up June and made dinner, I noticed something strange on my apartment door. A faint smear like someone had brushed their fingers along the wood. It was barely visible, but my instincts jolted awake. I checked the peephole. Nothing. Inside, June hummed as she colored tulips. I forced a smile and sat beside her, but my thoughts spiraled. If my father wanted to destroy what was left of our family, why now? Why feed me evidence against Claire? Why push me toward the will? What was he trying to expose? At 9:30, my phone buzzed. No number, just a single line. You're only seeing the cracks. You haven't seen the foundation. My pulse hammered. Before I could process the message, someone knocked on my door. 3 soft, deliberate taps. I froze. Then a voice spoke. Emily. It's me, my mother. I opened the door. She stood in the hallway wearing a thin coat, her hair unbrushed, her eyes red and swollen. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. I pulled her inside. She gripped my arm like a woman drowning. He called me, she said. Your father. He said if I didn't help him, he'd make sure the truth came out. What truth, I asked. Her breath shuddered. About Claire. About everything. I felt dread crawl up my spine. Mom, what did Claire do besides disable the monitor? Her lips trembled. She wasn't supposed to be alone with June that night. I stared at her. What do you mean? I told her not to go. Mom whispered. I told her to stay home, but she went anyway. She said she deserved to see June because she was the one who'd taken care of me all those years. She said you owed her. I felt my stomach twist. And the money I asked the bank transfers. She demanded it. Mom sobbed. She said she'd tell you private things if I didn't. Things from before your father left. Things I never wanted either of you to hear. What things? My voice was barely audible. Mom shook her head violently. Your father knows them and he's using them. A chill spread through me. Mom, I whispered. What is he blackmailing you with? Before she could answer, someone knocked again, harder. Both of us froze. I stepped quietly to the door, looked through the peephole, and felt the air leave my lungs. A man stood in the hallway. Gray hair, weathered face, eyes sharp as broken glass. My father. He smiled and lifted his hand to the peephole as if greeting me through it. Emily. He called softly. Open the door. We have a lot of catching up to do. My mother whimpered behind me. I stepped back, pulse racing, heart slamming against my ribs. He knocked again, slow, rhythmic, like a code I didn't understand. Let's talk family, he said, before someone else gets hurt. The knocking didn't stop immediately. It came in measured strikes, each one a reminder of a childhood memory. I had worked hard to bury my father tapping a coin against the kitchen table when he was irritated, bored, or about to break something. My mother clung to my arm. I gestured for her to stay quiet. June slept down the hall, unaware that a ghost from my past stood outside our door, threatening to bring ruin with him. After a long pause, my father's voice softened into something almost conversational. You can pretend you don't hear me, Emily, but I promise you I'm not going anywhere. I didn't speak, I didn't move. Finally, the footsteps retreated. A door closed somewhere down the hall. Silence settled over the apartment like a heavy blanket. My mother collapsed into a chair, shaking. I locked the door again, checked the windows, checked the hallway, through the peephole. Empty. Mom, I said you need to tell me everything right now. She covered her face with her palms. I never wanted you to know. To know what? She lowered her hands, eyes glassy. He didn't just leave us, Emily. He left because Claire pushed him. I blinked. What? He and Claire were fighting constantly near the end, Mom said, voice trembling. He favored you. You were younger, you needed more. You cried when he didn't show. Claire, she didn't cry, she got angry. I felt the ground shift beneath me. One day, Mom continued, he tried to discipline her for skipping school. She screamed at him. She told him she wished he was gone. She told him he wasn't a real father. And he snapped back. He said he wasn't staying with a family who didn't want him. So he left because of Claire, I whispered. No, Mom said, shaking her head. He left because he wanted to hurt us. But Claire believed it was her fault. She carried that guilt into adulthood. It shaped her. And she blamed me, I asked. She blamed your existence, Mom whispered. She thought if you hadn't needed so much, he wouldn't have left. My stomach twisted. That doesn't excuse what she did. No, it doesn't. Mom wiped her cheeks. But your father knows this guilt. He caused it, and now he's using it. I tried to steady my breath. Using it for what? Mom hesitated, swallowed, then forced the words out. He wants the house, the inheritance, all of it. And he's blackmailing you. Yes, she whispered. He said, if I didn't cooperate, he'd tell everyone the truth. That I drove him out. That Claire caused it, that our family was toxic long before June was born. He wants to destroy the narrative I built. The one where he was the villain and I was the mother who held everything together. I stared at her. Mom, you lied about him. Her voice cracked. I wasn't strong enough to tell you the truth. I was ashamed. And he knows that shame is my weakness. I sank into a chair across from her. So he came back, I said slowly, to punish you. She nodded, and to punish the daughters who survived without him. I felt something shift inside me, a clarity that came not from calm, but from crisis. My father wasn't here to reconcile. He wasn't here to fix anything. He wanted to reclaim the power he lost, and he was using both of us, me and Claire, as tools to break our mother. Mom, I said you have to come clean. Everything to the police, to the lawyers. This stops only when the truth stops being a weapon he can use. She looked at me with hollow fear. If I tell the truth, I'll lose everything. You already have, I said gently. But if you don't talk, you'll lose more. Her face crumpled. A dull thud sounded outside the apartment. Both of us jumped. I rushed to the peephole, nothing. Then my phone buzzed. A new text. You took too long. Now I decide what happens next. My skin went cold. Another message followed instantly. Check your mailbox. I grabbed my keys and ran downstairs, ignoring my mother's desperate plea to stop. The hallway lights flickered as I moved the building unusually silent. My mailbox was half open. Inside was a single envelope with no stamp. My father's handwriting on the front. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside was a photo, June, taken that morning, walking into school, alone. A block of ice settled inside my chest. On the back of the photograph, 4 words were written. "Time's up, Emily." My knees nearly buckled. He wasn't just threatening us anymore. He was escalating. And the next move in this dangerous game would be mine. I don't remember climbing the stairs back to my apartment. I only remember the sensation of running underwater. My limbs heavy, my breath thin. The world tilting as if some unseen current was dragging me toward a place I was not prepared to go. When I burst through the door, my mother was still at the kitchen table, her hands clasped, praying in a desperate whisper I hadn't heard since childhood. "Mom," I said, holding up the photograph with a trembling hand. He followed her. Today, he was close enough to take this. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "Oh God, oh God!" My thoughts spun in a tight loop. June walking into school, her backpack bouncing lightly, completely unaware that someone with blood ties and dark intentions had been standing nearby, photographing her like prey. I felt something rise in me, then a force I didn't recognize at first. Not fear, not rage, something older, something ancestral. The fierce, uncompromising instinct of a mother whose child has been threatened one time too many. "This ends tonight," I said. My mother looked up, startled. "Emily, what are you going to do?" "What you should have done years ago," I said quietly. "Tell the truth, all of it." I called Detective Harris. My voice didn't shake. My resolve didn't waver. "Meet me at the station in 1 hour," I told him. "I'm ready to give a full statement." "Emily," he said, "are you safe right now?" "Not if I stay silent." He didn't argue. He simply said, "I'll be waiting." Before leaving, I tucked June into the back seat of my mother's car, instructing her to drive straight to my friend Sarah's house, a woman I trusted with my life. "Don't stop," I told Mom. "Not for gas, not for anything. Go straight to her." My mother touched my cheek. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Sorry doesn't fix the past," I said gently, "but the truth can fix the future." When their taillights disappeared, I stood alone in the parking lot. The night was cold enough to burn my lungs. A street lamp buzzed overhead, casting a weak halo across cracked pavement. My phone buzzed. A new text. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I typed back with steady fingers, "Come find me." Seconds later, another message arrived. "Already here." A shadow separated from the far side of the lot. A man stepped forward. Broad shoulders, gray stubble, the same sharp eyes I remembered from childhood arguments, and slammed doors. My father looked older, but the energy around him was the same. Explosive, unpredictable, hungry for control. "Emily," he said, spreading his arms as if greeting a long-lost friend. "You look good." "Don't come closer," I warned. He paused, tilting his head. "You've grown a spine. I'm proud." "Where's the original of that photo?" I asked. "What did you do today? Did you follow her inside?" His smile chilled me. "Relax. Children are resilient. You should know." "That's not an answer." He shrugged. "I've been watching you for months. Watching both of you. Watching the way your mother fed Claire the illusion of importance. Watching Claire crumble under the weight of that illusion. Watching you refuse to play the roles they wrote for you." "You used her," I said. "You used all of us." He laughed softly. "I didn't have to use anyone. Your mother built a system of favoritism so deep that I only had to tap it, and everything cracked open." "You blackmailed her?" I reminded her who she's always been. He stepped closer. "A woman who lies to keep the peace. A woman who chooses the daughter she thinks she can save while abandoning the one who needs her most. She was trying to protect us. From me." His smile faded. "I wasn't the destructive force in this family. I just left before it drowned me." "That's a lie." "Is it? Think, Emily. Your mother hid the truth. Claire believed she was responsible for my leaving. You believed you were helpless. I walk back into town and the entire house of cards collapses. That tells you something." He took another step. "You're the one who fed Claire the stories," I realized slowly. "You're the one who told her she wasn't loved. You're the one who made her believe I ruined everything." "She already believed it," he said. "I just gave her permission to act on it." My breath caught. So the night June nearly died, he held up a hand. I didn't touch your child. I'm not a monster, but I did tell Claire that you needed humbling, that you'd taken too much from her. Too much from everyone. You planted the idea, she made the choice. His eyes hardened. Don't rewrite that part. My pulse thundered. Everything in me wanted to lunge at him to tear the truth from him with my hands. But then headlights swept across the lot, 2 police cruisers turning in. My father's expression shifted. For the first time, fear cracked through his confidence. You called them, he said. Yes. You think they'll believe you over me? I don't need them to believe me. I said I need them to stop you. Detective Harris stepped out of the cruiser, hand on his holster. 2 officers flanked him. Sir, put your hands where we can see them, Harris commanded. My father raised his hands, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. You think this ends with me in handcuffs? He asked. You have no idea how deep this goes. I know enough, I said. He scoffed. No, you don't. Another officer approached, pulling his hands behind his back. As the cuffs clicked into place, my father leaned forward slightly, voice low, meant only for me. I didn't destroy this family, he murmured. You did when you decided to fight back. No, I said quietly. I saved it. He barked a laugh. This isn't over. Harris stepped between us. Emily, go. We'll take it from here. I walked backward until the officers pushed my father into the cruiser. He stared at me through the window, eyes burning with a rage so old it had turned into purpose. When the car finally pulled away, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The next hours blurred statements, paperwork, phone calls. My mother arrived at the station shaking, ready to tell her truth. She confessed the financial transfers, the manipulation, the guilt, the way my father had resurfaced and threatened to expose her. Harris listened, his pen still, his eyes careful. By dawn, my father was in custody on charges ranging from extortion to stalking to witness intimidation. He would face more. So would Claire now, with fuller context for her motives, her unraveling and the pressure that shaped her choices. And my mother, she cried openly in a way I had never seen. When she finished her statement, she reached for my hand. I failed you, she whispered. No, I said gently. You just didn't know how to protect us. But now you do. We sat in silence for a long time, as if mourning the family we once pretended to be. By the time I drove home, the sun was rising, painting the sky in soft gold. The world felt different, lighter, though not healed. Healing would come later in slow, quiet moments. When I stepped into the apartment, June ran to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. I lifted her, pressed my cheek to her hair, breathed her in. Mama, she said, are we safe now? I thought of the trial, of the will, of the hidden truths, of my father's smile in the darkness. We're safer, I said, and we're getting safer every day. That night, after June fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote the first line of a new chapter in our lives. One not defined by betrayal, but by resilience. And as I closed the notebook, I whispered the words I needed to believe. The cycle ends with me. To anyone listening, to anyone who has lived through family fractures and quiet trauma, to anyone who has had to fight for a justice no one wanted to see, this story is yours too. If it spoke to you, if it made you think, if it gave you strength, leave a comment below, share your story, subscribe for more.